So good evening everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 18th July 2025 and today we have some very important topics from different newspapers. So one by one we'll try to discuss all these important topics in a very detailed and in-depth manner. So without any further delay, let's get into the discussion. But before that, so we have a PDF of this discussion is available in the description section and you can access the PDF of this class, right? So the first topic with which we are going to start this session is a very important topic, which is US sanctions on Russian oil. Now we all knew that India is one of the topmost country which imports Russian oil. But because of Russia-Ukraine war and US attempts to make a ceasefire or to make a deal between Russia and Ukraine, however, the problem is that Russia is not coming to a pact with US or with a Ukraine. So therefore, recently what happened was US in general and NATO Secretary General in particular threatened India, China and Brazil that US will impose sanctions on these three countries if they continue to procure Russian oil. So this is the context in which this has been given. However, India also strongly responded to these remarks by NATO's Secretary General. So therefore, if you carefully look into this topic, it is being said that India has cautioned US that US backed sanctions which targets the buyers of Russian oil. Remember, India is one of the topmost buyers of Russian oil because US is going to propose Russian Sanctions Act of 2025. So under Russian Sanctions Act of 2025, if any country purchases Russian oil, US will impose sanctions on those countries. However, this Russian Sanctions Act of 2025 is a bill that is not yet became a legislation in US, and if it becomes a legislation, it proposes to impose at least 500% of duties on countries including India, China and Brazil. So however, India, China and Brazil, they have responded strongly to US sanctions. Now understand one thing, for India's energy security, India importing oil from Russia is very important. And it is also part of India's policy of strategic autonomy. So therefore, no other country should force India to stop buying oil from Russia. It is in India's national interest and India will continue to do so. No country should threaten India for India buying Russian oil. Right? So therefore, in this context, how India responds to US and NATO's pressure with respect to buying Russian oil. Now, as I have already told you that US is going to pass Russian Sanctions Act of 2025. So under this proposed legislation, if any country trades with Russia, US will impose 500% sanctions or 500% duties on those respective countries. So it will hit India's trade with US if US really imposes tariffs on India. So therefore, this Russian Sanctions Act of 2025 has been introduced in US Congress, and it also seeks to impose around 500% of valorum duties on countries which have been purchasing or procuring Russian oil and petro products. Now, US and other Western countries claims that countries like India and China buying Russian oil and they are financing Russian war efforts against Ukraine. And this is their allegation on India. However, there was already a legislation which imposes sanctions on countries which trade with Russia, which is Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which is also known as CAATSA Act. So that CAATSA Act is already in existence in US, right? So which is Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. So as I have already told you that NATO's Secretary General, he threatened India, China and Brazil for importing Russian oil, and he also asked these three countries to stop buying Russian oil. So if these countries don't stop purchasing Russian oil, they will face sanctions under new Russian Sanctions Act of 2025, which is going to impose 500% sanctions on the countries which purchase Russian oil. However, the Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson recently stressed that India's energy needs, India's energy securities is very important. And he also warned against the double standards of global diplomacy, the double standards in global diplomacy by NATO or by US. And there was a strong reaction from Petroleum Minister Mr. Hardeep Singh Puri as well. In an interview, he also stated that India would deal with the sanctions if they are passed, and he highlighted India's shift from 27 to 40 oil source countries. Now, what does this signifies? It signifies India has been diversifying the resources or the resource base. India will no longer dependent on only few countries. India has been exploring opportunities to import oil from Africa, Latin America, Middle East and other different countries. And apart from that, India has also been exploring for petroleum reserves in India. So therefore, I hope you have understood the context and the topic as well. So therefore, the next important topic is about equal inheritance rights. Now this is also very important for your General Studies paper 2. Now what is this topic and why it is in news? So recently the Supreme Court upholds equal inheritance rights for tribal women. Now this is important because it stressed on equal inheritance rights for women also. There is no inequality when it comes to the inheritance rights. So the context is that in one of its ruling, the Supreme Court declared that the tribal woman cannot be denied their ancestral property, and it should not be solely based on gender. For example, if a tribal woman, she should not be denied her rights to the ancestral property because she is a woman. And this is a landmark judgment by the Supreme Court. And in fact, this judgment by the Supreme Court also ensures that the constitutional equality, which is recognized under Article 14 of the Indian Constitution and Article 16 of the Indian Constitution, in tribal inheritance cases. And apart from that, it also reverses the earlier rulings, and those earlier rulings already upheld the patriarchal customs over women's rights. So therefore, the Supreme Court has rightly reversed the earlier rulings, and thereby it is a significant step forward for the tribal woman inheritance of ancestral property, and that is why it is important. Now I hope you have understood the context. Now what are the key observations of the Supreme Court in this judgment? Now this Supreme Court bench, which has been comprising Justice Sanjay Karol, Justice Joy Malia Bakshi, So they have ruled in favor of the tribal woman, and she's from Chhattisgarh. And in fact, the bench of the Supreme Court claimed that claiming inheritance from her maternal grandfather, highlighting importance of tribal women and their inheritance rights. It says that the tribal women have inheritance rights. So therefore, it has recognized the constitutional right of the woman. And it has also held that the gender-based denial of property to a tribal woman is unconstitutional because it violates the constitutional provisions. And being violative of the constitutional provisions, it is also unjust, because you cannot solely deny property to a tribal woman because she is a woman. So thereby, this judgment of the Supreme Court rightly challenging the traditional male-dominated inheritance practices which are existing in Indian society. And apart from that, the Supreme Court has also rightly stated that equal rights for women must be upheld in tribal succession as well, even in the absence of the codified personal laws. So thereby emphasizing the need for gender equality in the tribal communities. In fact, the Supreme Court has also criticized the lower courts for expecting women to prove the existence of inclusive customs, and instead of requiring opposing party to prove exclusionary customs. Right? So the lower courts favored the male dominance or the patriarchal inheritance of ancestral property, and that's why the Supreme Court has criticized the lower courts. So overall, the ruling of the Supreme Court has emphasized that customs cannot override the constitutional guarantees. So there are certain constitutional guarantees, for example, Article 14, which guarantees right to equality, and Article 15, Clause 1, no discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, and place of birth. So therefore, the customs cannot override the constitutional guarantees under Article 14 and Article 15, Clause 1. They protect the inheritance rights of the tribal woman. So therefore, she is rightly eligible for the inheritance of ancestral property, and there should be no discrimination against her because she is just simply a woman. And this is what the Supreme Court has said in this case. Now, what should be the broader implications for tribal gender justice after this judgment by the Supreme Court? Now, this particular judgment by the Supreme Court can be viewed as a progressive judgment because it sets a progressive precedent for gender equality in tribal communities, because this judgment has upheld the right of women to inherit the ancestral property. So therefore, it sets a progressive precedent for gender equality in tribal communities, because in tribal communities the inheritance is often governed by the unwritten customs, and these unwritten customs have historically favored male members, and they upheld the male dominance or the patriarchy. So therefore, it sets a progressive precedent, and that ensures women also have the inheritance rights to the ancestral property, and that is the first thing. Secondly, this judgment by the Supreme Court also dismantles the patriarchal assumption. Now, the patriarchal assumption here is that women are excluded from succession by default in tribal societies. So therefore, challenging the long-held and long-standing male-centric practices which are existing in the tribal communities. So thirdly, The ruling by the Supreme Court also reinforced that the constitutional principles which override the unjust traditions, for example Article 14, Article 15, Clause 1, so they override the unjust traditions and unwritten customs in tribal communities, especially when it comes to matters of livelihood and property. So therefore, it ensures that the tribal women inheritance rights are adequately protected by the Constitution. And apart from that, the Supreme Court's judgment on this matter rightly calls for scrutiny of the customary practices which are followed in these tribal communities. And apart from that, those customary practices which deny the equal rights for women, especially when they are not codified, when they are not written, and the customs and traditions are not legally recognized, so thereby potentially leading to a more equitable tribal inheritance systems in India that could uphold the women's rights in these tribal communities. However, it is expected that this judgment of the Supreme Court may trigger the greater awareness and assertion of property rights by the tribal women all across India, and empowering to claim that their rightful inheritance to the ancestral property, and also the gender equality when it comes to inheriting the ancestral property. Now, if we talk about the tribal laws and the constitutional protections, so firstly, the Hindu Succession Act of 1956, which may be considered as a foundational act that deals with the succession. And the Hindu Succession Act of 1956, it does not apply to the scheduled tribes. So therefore, it leaves succession to be governed by tribal customs unless otherwise legislated. Secondly, Article 14, it talks about equality before law and equal protection of laws. So therefore, it forms the basis for the Supreme Court's judgment on the tribal woman inheritance. Now, you should not deny property to a woman, an ancestral property to a woman based on her gender. So Article 15 also says the same. There should not be any discrimination based on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth. Right? So therefore, the Supreme Court has upheld Article 14 and Article 15 Clause 1 of the fundamental rights. However, the principles of justice, equality, conscience, so they also applies for the customary law, is silent or unclear on matters such as tribal woman inheritance. Now, the customs and traditions are not codified, they're not clear, and they're not legally recognized. So therefore, it is important to look into those customs, traditions from the lenses of justice, equity, and the good consciousness as well. However, the tribal autonomy, because the tribal communities enjoys a certain degree of autonomy, the tribal autonomy, when it comes to their personal laws and their governance, it cannot justify discrimination or the denial of the fundamental rights, including their inheritance rights for the tribal woman. So these are the constitutional provisions and the tribal laws which deals with the inheritance of the property for the tribal woman. Now, I hope you have understood this topic. And next topic is about the Poshan Tracker app. Now, what is the context of this particular topic? Now, one thing that we should understand here is that India is a country with the highest burden of malnourished kids. So it's not just about the malnourished kids. Around 2/3 of Indian women are also malnourished, or I would say they are suffering with anemia. So therefore, the Poshan Tracker app has been launched by the Union government in the year 2018 in the state of Rajasthan to ensure that adequate nutrition and the nutritious support is given to the pregnant, lactating mothers, adolescent girls and young kids, because it could have a multi-pronged impact, because adequate nutrition will ensure health of different categories of people. It improves the learning outcomes, it reduces the maternal mortality rate and infant mortality rate as well. And that is why the Portion Tracker app is very, very important. Now, what is the context and why it is in news? Now, you can see here in this article, it says glitches in Portion app hindering the beneficiaries registration in Haryana. So the Anganwadi workers who are working with this Portion Tracker app to register the beneficiaries, so they are facing technical challenges in registering pregnant and lactating women on this Portion Tracker app, thereby delaying access to the nutritional benefits under the Poshan Abhiyan scheme. However, so if we talk about the Portion Tracker app, this Portion Tracker app has been developed by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. And in fact, the Portion Tracker app will actually monitor the service delivery and the nutritional outcomes under the Poshan Abhiyan, which was launched in the year 2018. However, the Portion Tracker app mandates facial recognition and Aadhaar based eKYC for the authentication of the beneficiaries, and also including children through the guardian's Aadhaar address. Now, what is the role of the Anganwadi workers when it comes to the implementation of this Poshan Abhiyan, which aimed at ensuring adequate nutrition for every child, every pregnant and lactating mothers and the adolescent girls? Now here the Anganwadi workers are considered as the frontline workers or the frontline service providers under the Integrated Child Development Services. And apart from that, the Anganwadi workers and their duties including registering beneficiaries, ensuring nutrition supplementation, immunization and the preschool education as well. Now if we talk about the Mission Poshan 2.0 or Saksham Anganwadi, what are the objectives that the government has launched this scheme? Now under the scheme, around 2 lakh Anganwadis to be upgraded as Saksham Anganwadis, and nutritious norms and standards to be improved, quality and testing of take-home ration would be further strengthened, traditional community kitchens or food habits to be further promoted, which could address the existing malnutrition among the different categories of people, delivery of food under the supplementary nutrition program to be further optimized under this program. So if we talk about Akash Prime missile, now what is the context? The context is that recently the Akash Prime missile has been successfully tested. Now we will understand what is Akash Prime missile. Now what is its range and what is its importance? So we'll be understanding about this missile. Now such missiles are very important in the backdrop of aggressive neighbors that India is situated in. There are speculations about 2-front war or 2.5 front war. So therefore, in this context, India indigenously developing such missiles and regularly testing them would further enhance India's strategic advantages. What is the context? The context is that Indian Army and Defense Research and Development Organization, they have successfully conducted a high altitude trials of the indigenously developed Akash Prime air defense system in Ladakh. with Prithvi 2 and Agni 1 ballistic missiles were test fired from Chandipur on the same day. So integrated test range, which is located in Chandipur in the state of Odisha, both Prithvi 2 and Agni 1 ballistic missiles were also test fired. Now if we talk about Akash Prime missile, now this Akash Prime missile can be considered as an upgraded version of already existing Akash surface to air missile, which is also called as SAM, right? So this is surface to air missile, and in fact the Akash Prime missile has been developed and designed to engage the aerial targets such as aircrafts, helicopters, UAVs and the cruise missiles at a medium range. However, the recent trials of this Akash Prime missile at over 1500 feet in Ladakh, so they have successfully demonstrated a high altitude operational capability with direct hits on the fast moving aerial targets. Now one specific thing about Akash Prime missile is that it can be tested from, or it can be used in a high altitude areas. It can be launched in a high altitude areas, and that is a strategic advantage for India. And if we talk about the Defense Research and Development Organization that has been pioneering the defense technologies, and that has been playing a very important role when it comes to designing the indigenous technologies. So therefore the system is developed by DRDO and is part of India's the broader efforts to further enhance India's indigenous defense manufacturing under initiatives like Atmanirbhar Bharat in defense sector. If we talk about the strategic ballistic missiles Agni 1 and Prithvi 2, now Agni 1 is a short range ballistic missile with a range of around 700 kilometers. And Agni 1 is also capable of carrying nuclear warheads. It can carry nuclear warheads, and it is a road or rail mobile or developed under the Integrated Guided Missile Development Program. And similarly, Prithvi 2 is also part of the Integrated Guided Missile Development Program, and it has a range of 250 to 350 kilometers, and it is a short range ballistic missile, and it uses a liquid propulsion system, and it is primarily used by the Indian Army. So these are the three strategic missiles. The next important topic is recent Axiom 4 mission. So through Axiom 4 mission, so Indian astronaut Subhanshu Shukla became the first Indian to reach the International Space Station. His journey to the International Space Station will provide India's Gaganyaan mission a key insights, and it will also help in the success of Gaganyaan mission. If we talk about the Gaganyaan mission, it is India's first manned space mission. If this mission is successful, India will become the fourth country to successfully send human beings into the space. The first three countries are USSR, or the present day Russia, US, China, and next it will be India. And the Gaganyaan mission, India is going to send the Vyomonauts into the low Earth orbit, and they will spend some days in the low Earth orbit, and they will conduct different experiments before heading back to India. The context is the return of Group Captain Mr. Subhanshu Shukla from this Axiom 4 mission to the International Space Station. So it marks India's first crewed commercial space flight, which is Gaganyaan mission, signaling a milestone in its space flight program. Now, if we talk about Subhanshu Shukla's journey to the International Space Station through this Axiom 4 mission, right? So it actually represents the first instance of any Indian serving on a commercial human space flight. So therefore, it symbolizes India's further deepening role in global crewed space exploration. And in fact, so this mission to International Space Station also underscores India's overall enormous potential in adapting to rigorous international space standards and validates the reliability of the private sector space transportation in the complex scientific missions. And in fact, there will be a lot of learnings from the Axiom 4 mission to the International Space Station, and it will strengthen its roadmap, India's roadmap for Gaganyaan mission and future low Earth orbit missions as well. And one such mission is Gaganyaan mission. Now, what should be the key learnings from this Axiom 4 and what global synergies that we might have? Now, in fact, this Axiom 4 mission offers some critical insights or inputs into the multidisciplinary crew training, which involves the non-career military professionals, thereby expanding the scope of future Indian astronaut profiles as well. And apart from that, this Axiom 4 mission also highlights the methodologies, and that methodologies are used to manage the microgravity induced psychological changes or physiological changes, the conditioning and real-time problem solving, and they are essential for India's human space flight ambitions. However, the exposure to advanced launch sequencing, pre-mission simulations, integration with international modules, this improves ISRO's mission and the management capabilities as well. And some important details about the Gaganyaan mission have been given here. Please go through all these details. Now, if we talk about the future outlook and India's strategic positioning as part of this Gaganyaan mission, now Axiom Space, they aim to replace the International Space Station with a commercial space station. And in fact, this also aligns with India's aspirations under the Bharatiya Antariksh mission, and it offers avenues for the private sector partnership as well. And we also wanted to have a Bharatiya Antariksh station by the year 2035. So therefore, the Axiom Space mission's aims are aligning with India's aspirations. And this Gaganyaan project, and it will be supported by Indian private firms and even the global companies like SpaceX and Blue Origins. So therefore, it expected to evolve a broader program which involves moon bases, low Earth orbit infrastructure as well. So thereby leveraging global cooperation, India aims to secure a long strategic autonomy through indigenous space technology, thereby sustaining the astronaut training and eventual independent orbital platforms as well for India. So that's all in this lecture, and I hope you have understood all these topics. Thank you so much.